In March 1944, I had flown King Boris of Bulgaria back to Sofia and was on my way home to Munich. Not far from Belgrade, we received a message advising us to land because strong US bomber forces with fighter escort were entering the area. Such fighter planes had already shot down several of our regular planes to Belgrade. However, we had no passengers on board, so I decided to risk it, merely warning our machine gunners to keep their eyes peeled and asking both Belgrade and Graz to keep us informed of the enemy's whereabouts. About 10 minutes before Graz, we received a WT signal indicating that strong forces of American planes had just passed Udine, flying towards Graz. Around Graz itself, the weather was very clear, but as we approached the Alps, we found cloud cover between about 13,000 and 18,000 feet. I was flying at about 12,500 feet. The Americans now appeared about 5,000 feet above us. Several hundred bombers escorted by fighters and the Graz anti-aircraft guns opened up. At the same time, the bombs began to fall on Graz. I changed course to the northwest. So far, none of the fighters had spotted me, but they might do so at any minute. I remained close above the lowest cloud level and did my best to make an unseen getaway. Beyond Eisenberg, I flew over the Loben ironworks, and heavy flak began to come up. The firing was very accurate too, at the right height and all of it within a radius of 50 yards or so, with us in the centre. My propellers were constantly cutting through disagreeable little white clouds. I instructed Zintel to fire recognition signals, but he found it very difficult to get the cartridges into the rocket pistol and quite impossible to fire them. As we discovered later, the cartridges were covered with an extra thick layer of colourless lacquer and wouldn't slide into the chamber properly. In the meantime, the firing went on, burst after burst of it. Our windows were holed, our wings were hit by splinters, and one of our tanks was leaking. As we were unable to give recognition signals, my wireless operator put a PAN or Air SOS call through to Munich, telling them that we were being heavily fired on by our own flak, a message which caused consternation. After about 5 minutes, we were out of range, and we got back to Munich, where a couple of days' intensive repair work put us in order again. 2 weeks before Mussolini was arrested, I flew Hitler to Treviso with Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl. By 16 hours, we were back on the airfield again. It was easy to see that things had changed in Italy. The population kept well in the background, and there were no enthusiastic crowds this time. In fact, the whole atmosphere was cold and hostile. Hitler pretended to have noticed nothing, and when he took leave of Mussolini, it was with stressed warmth. At the takeoff, my outer starboard engine began misbehaving, but we got away all right. The weather was bad over the Brenner, so I flew via Udine to Wiener Neustadt and on to Vienna, and from there to Obersalzberg. We hadn't been flying long when the engine which had been giving trouble cut out altogether, and I had to make do with 3 engines, but we arrived safely. It appeared that in the special train which had taken Hitler to the conference, Italian officers had tried again and again to separate Hitler from his companions, and this mysterious affair took on a sinister air a couple of weeks later, when we heard of Mussolini's arrest. Jodl in particular was furious, because during the conference, the Italian General Staff officers had made promises and accepted undertakings, which they could obviously have had no intention of keeping. Hitler was very upset by the fate which had befallen his friend Mussolini, and he immediately made plans to release him. The coup was very daring, and it succeeded. But when Mussolini arrived at our headquarters, he was obviously a broken man. He had lost so much weight and he looked so ill that it was not easy to recognize him at all. Hitler handed him over to Professor Morel for treatment. After Mussolini returned to Italy and took up his headquarters near Milan, Morel kept in touch by telephone until one day the Italian doctors informed him that his treatment was no longer necessary. The patient was completely well again. Things began to break up in Bulgaria too, and a couple of weeks before his death I flew King Boris from Sofia to Rastenburg. On the return flight the weather was wonderful, but although the king, who had in the meantime become an enthusiastic flyer, greatly enjoyed the flight, he was unable to conceal his depression. He had staked everything on Our Führer, and now he was compelled to realize that his card had been trumped. 2 days after his arrival in Sofia, the German embassy informed Hitler that King Boris was seriously ill. Hitler called me and told me to get ready to fly Professor Morel to Sofia, but the king thanked Hitler for his kindness, saying that he had good doctors in Sofia who could look after him. A matter of days after that we heard that he was dead. Our intelligence service reported that, in fact, he had not died of angina pectoris at all, as we had been told. He had been poisoned. I flew Hitler to Reims, and from there he went by car to a base on the coast to watch the discharge of the first V2 on England. The next morning, when we flew back, Hitler was full of it, and he seemed deeply impressed. What he longed to hear now was how the British had taken it. But the British didn't let on. Unarmed 2-seater jet planes equipped with cameras were sent over to see what they could find out. Of course, they could easily outfly any British fighter plane, but they flew at between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, and the photographs they brought back told us very little. Then the invasion took place, and scotched the idea that we could cripple Britain before it could be launched. The first operations on the French coast definitely buried Germany's last hopes, and before long the bases from which the V2s were fired were lost too. If the V2 had become operational in strength 12 months earlier, things might have been different. I often heard it said from informed quarters that Hitler had waited with the V2 until a sufficient number could be accumulated, and I can remember the tremendous impression the first demonstration of this new weapon made on us. It was shortly after the successful culmination of the military campaign in the West, i.e. in 1940, and I flew Hitler to Peenemünde. On the testing grounds, we took up our position behind a 13-foot-thick concrete barrier. A little distance away was the snail-like housing in which, we were told, the proper mixture of liquid oxygen and peroxide was obtained to fuel the rocket. Behind the firing platform was a great pit about 65 feet deep. I can't remember which impressed me most at the time, the ear-splitting noise as the rocket was discharged, or the tremendous white cloud which stabbed downwards into the enormous pit and blew out the great tree trunks which lined it, tossing them into the air as though they were matchsticks. We were told that approximately 500,000 horsepower had been generated by the explosion, a simply gigantic concentration of power for the general technological level of those days. Those responsible for the production and testing of the rocket believed that it could be made operational within a year, but in fact various difficulties were encountered, and there were long delays. The test rockets did not keep to the prescribed course, and for a long time it proved impossible to find out why. Finally, it was discovered that the emptying of the tanks during the flight upset the flight stability and caused deviations. Special bulkheads were then incorporated, and finally the V2 was ready to become operational. The scientists responsible for the V2 were well aware that they had opened up a new phase in the development of war, and that the V2 was the pioneer of ballistic missiles which would one day soar over whole continents. In July, I once again flew to Romania and brought Marshal Antonescu back to Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. It proved to be his last visit. I had orders to land at a certain time in Rastenburg, and in order not to get there too soon, I made an intermediate landing in Krakow, which was just as well, because one of my engines had been giving me trouble on the flight from Bucharest, and in Krakow I was able to have it put right. The Marshal was to fly back to Romania the same afternoon, and when he arrived on the airfield, he seemed very depressed. Hitler had obviously been able to offer him only very cold comfort. We hadn't been in the air more than a minute or two when an engine defect made itself apparent, and I put back and landed. Antonescu was very disturbed and unwilling to believe that it was merely an accident. He feared sabotage. I ordered another machine to be made ready, but before this could be done, our own machine was put in order, and we used that after all. When we landed in Bucharest 4 hours later, there were far more people on the airfield to greet the Marshal than was customary. As soon as he descended, he was surrounded by generals and other high officers and bombarded with questions. It was not difficult to see that the answers he gave satisfied no one. The general air of disappointment was too obvious. Clearly, nothing he could do or say could now alter the conviction of them all that they were facing defeat. The commandant of the airfield told me that cases of sabotage were rapidly on the increase and that there was a good deal of feeling in the country against Germany. Within a couple of weeks, the Russians occupied the whole of Romania. Another chapter had ended. Weeks before 20th of July, I received special instructions from General Müller, the head of the Reich Security Service, to intensify all precautions and to take special care to ensure that all security arrangements were strictly adhered to. From time to time, dummy attempts were made on Hitler's plane to test whether, in fact, these instructions were being carried out with sufficient care. And on one occasion, something actually was overlooked. There were insistent rumours that an attempt was being planned on Hitler's life. On 20th of July, I was with Flight Captain Doldy at the dental clinic attached to Himmler's headquarters when I was called to the telephone and told, "Return at once and bring Doldy with you." Doldy had just had an injection prior to having a tooth extracted, but he had to go off with me without the extraction. He was wanted to fly Himmler to Berlin. Within 20 minutes, we were at Hitler's headquarters. There we learned what had happened and saw the hut which had been devastated by the explosion. Colonel Stauffenberg, an officer who had lost an eye and an arm in action, was suspected, and there was a hue and cry after him. The concrete bunker in which the situation discussions usually took place was not being used at the time. Work was going on to strengthen it by a further 10 feet of concrete, because intelligence had discovered that the Americans had perfected 10-ton bombs, which were in all probability heavy enough to penetrate the 13-foot-thick concrete bunkers previously used. For the moment, therefore, meetings took place in an ordinary wooden hut above ground. Gradually, the investigation pieced together what had happened. A Heinkel landed on Rastenburg airfield with Colonel Stauffenberg and his adjutant, who drove together by car to Hitler's headquarters, where Stauffenberg informed the duty officer at the first control post that he had urgent instructions from the commander of the Reserve Army, General Fromm, and that he must speak to Field Marshal Keitel at once. The duty officer immediately telephoned the Field Marshal, who ordered that Stauffenberg should be allowed to pass. In this way, Stauffenberg passed 2 controls and presented himself to Field Marshal Keitel. On hearing what Stauffenberg had to say, Keitel got in touch with Hitler, who ordered that Stauffenberg should take part in the situation discussion, which was then just about to begin, as he, Stauffenberg, could then see the existing situation for himself and be able to report back according to the instructions General Fromm had given him. The situation discussions usually started at midday, and this one was no exception. A large and heavy table had been brought into the hut for the discussion, and it was the solidity of this table which probably saved Hitler's life. When Colonel Stauffenberg entered the hut, Hitler was already there, looking at a map which was spread out on the tabletop. He was leaning forward with one arm resting on the table, and with the other hand he was holding his forehead. Stauffenberg put down the briefcase he was carrying, which contained the time bomb, below the table opposite Hitler, so that Hitler's feet were not more than a few feet away. Stauffenberg then walked out of the hut, saying to someone who asked him where he was going that he had to telephone and would be right back. He did telephone to the airfield, ordering that the engines of his Heinkel should be warmed up for an immediate takeoff as he had to fly back to Berlin at once. He then went to his car, which was waiting for him less than 100 yards from the hut, and there he waited for the explosion. When it duly took place, he assumed that his attempt had been successful, and the next task was to get to Berlin as quickly as possible to let it be known there that Hitler was dead. He got into his car and instructed his chauffeur to drive back to the airfield. The first control post was less than 200 yards away, and this he passed without difficulty. But the outer control post had already received the alarm, and Stauffenberg's way to freedom was barred by an anti-tank gun and portable barbed wire entanglements. The duty officer informed him that the alarm had been given and that he was not allowed to let anyone pass. Stauffenberg declared that he had come straight from the Führer with urgent instructions to fly back to Berlin at once, and that anyone who attempted to hinder him would undertake a heavy responsibility. This warning may have disturbed the duty officer, but it didn't make him give way. Stauffenberg then demanded to see the officer commanding the post, who happened to be at lunch. He was called from the mess at once, and because he knew that Field Marshal Keitel had personally instructed Stauffenberg to be let in, he now gave the order to let him out again. The barbed wire entanglements were removed, the pole rose, and Stauffenberg's car drove through and off to the airfield. It was a 10-minute drive with no further control points, and when Stauffenberg arrived, the Heinkel was waiting with running engines. There was, of course, no reason for anyone at the airfield to suspect that anything was wrong, and nothing was done to prevent the takeoff. When Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin, fully convinced that Hitler was dead, his chief, General Fromm, was already aware that, in fact, Hitler was alive. He then took a step which subsequently gave rise to considerable differences of opinion. He ordered Stauffenberg's immediate execution. In the meantime, the most painstaking investigation into the whole affair was proceeding in Rastenburg. Stauffenberg's chauffeur was interrogated, and the only thing of any use he could say was that he thought Stauffenberg had thrown something out of the car on the way back to the airfield. A company of men was then set to search the sides of the road, and in a patch of stinging nettles a package of explosive was found, the same type which had been used in the attempt. It was of British origin, and it had a 10-minute mercury fuse. I had a look at it myself. It was a brown lump of plastic, looking something like wax, 6 inches square by 2.5 inches thick. According to experts, the explosive force should have been sufficient to kill everyone in the immediate neighbourhood, and in all probability would have been, had the conference and the explosion taken place in the confined space of the underground bunker. But in the lightly built hut above ground, the walls were just blown outwards, so that the very important resistance factor was absent. In consequence, the force of the explosion was dissipated in all directions, instead of being concentrated. Heinrich Berger, the official stenographer, who was sitting at the table opposite Hitler, lost both legs and quickly bled to death, but Hitler was just thrown backwards, and the only injury he sustained was a slight one in the arm. Security precautions at Hitler's headquarters were greatly increased after that. Colonel Strebe, with men of the Greater Germany Division, had previously been completely responsible for all security measures at Rastenburg, but now half the guards were Waffen-SS units and the other half men of the Greater Germany Division. Precautions were also taken against parachutists, trenches were dug and mines were laid, and altogether Hitler's headquarters began to look very warlike. In addition, certain measures, such as the personal searching of visitors, etc., were introduced, and this gave rise to a good deal of resentment. The general atmosphere was much tenser too, and as a result there were 1 or 2 incidents caused by sheer nervousness. On one occasion, for example, an anti-tank gun went off during an exercise. The shell tore through a hut and exploded against a tree, but no one was hurt, though the excitement was tremendous. The fighting in the east was now rolling up to Germany's frontiers, and Hitler gave instructions that trenches and other defensive works should be prepared to resist the invader. After a while he had the impression that his orders were not being carried out with sufficient zeal by the Wehrmacht commanders, so he sent for Koch, the Gauleiter of East Prussia, and instructed him to carry out the work with the Volkssturm, or Home Guard, and the local civilian population. The whole of eastern Germany was to be defended with line after line of trenches, earthworks and tank traps, and in fact, during flights we made over the border areas, we could see that Koch was conscientiously carrying out Hitler's orders. By the autumn, the fighting was only about 60 miles or so from Rastenburg. For the time being, Hitler continued to occupy his headquarters, partly, I believe, under the impression that his presence would strengthen the resistance. Russian planes were more and more frequent visitors now, and I began to wonder how long it would be before they attacked our airfield. I had already taken precautions. Most of my machines had been dispersed to various airfields in the neighbourhood, and I had sent away the greater part of my equipment and material, including our spare engines, to safety. As a matter of fact, the expected attack never took place. When we were back in the Reich Chancellery again, Speer asked me if I would fly a jet plane for him and let him have my impressions. I agreed at once, but I pointed out that I should have to get permission from Hitler. "Listen, Bauer," said Hitler when I raised the matter. "There have been so many unexplained crashes lately that I don't want you to take the risk. I need you still." So there was no jet flying for me, but one day I went along with Speer on a visit of inspection to Rechlin for a demonstration of the new Volksjet. This was a simplified jet with one engine only, and Speer reckoned that he could provide the Luftwaffe with 1,000 a month. By this time the jets had become operational, and they had already booked some striking successes. For example, on one occasion, a squadron of 6 jets attacked a bomber formation of 30 machines, shooting down 28 with the loss of only 1 jet. Up to that time, when you heard that 50 enemy bombers had been shot down, you knew perfectly well that at least the same number of our own fighters had been lost. But the jets had a speed of almost 600 miles an hour, which was fantastic for those days, and far greater than anything the enemy could put into the air, so the jet fighter was obviously the answer to their mass bomber attacks. When we arrived in Rechlin, the weather was so bad and visibility was so poor that any demonstration of the new Volksjet was out of the question, but at least we were given all the technical details and informed of all the latest developments. The old order, first given in 1943, for 1,000 jets a month was now repeated, but, as it turned out, with no greater success. In December 1944, Hitler ordered the abandonment of his Rastenburg headquarters, and the greater part of my equipment and material was sent by rail to the south. 50 of my men went off with a heavily loaded goods train towards Pocking in Lower Bavaria. On its way through Poland, this train came into collision with another goods train. 17 of my men were killed on the spot, and many others were more or less seriously injured. It was the first time our flight had suffered such heavy casualties. On 22nd December, the last members of the staff left Rastenburg, and I flew Hitler to Berlin. I was then given leave of absence for a few days, and flew to Munich to spend the Christmas holidays with my family. Soon afterwards, the Russians captured Rastenburg. Those of us from Bavaria had not gone willingly to Rastenburg, but we stayed there 3 years, and in that time we learned to appreciate the very different countryside of East Prussia and the sterling qualities of its inhabitants, so that in the end it was a real wrench to leave it, for we knew very well that we should not be going back there again. But at first there were other things to think of. In Berlin the last act was about to begin for Hitler, and for me, the penultimate. I spent New Year's Day 1945 in a maternity clinic in Seefeld near Munich, where my wife had just given birth to our 3rd daughter. To celebrate the new year, as well as the birth of my daughter, I had taken along sufficient glasses and champagne to supply all the nurses too, and when midnight came, many toasts were drunk and the usual good wishes exchanged. The atmosphere was cheerful enough for the moment, but I was secretly wondering, and I have no doubt a good many other people were too, what 1945 would bring for us. All hope of victory had gone, and the outlook was unpromising. On 15th January I flew back to Berlin. The Russians had burst out of the Vistula Bulge and were now fighting on German territory. And in the west, Hitler's last card had failed. After great preliminary successes, the Ardennes offensive, which was to have driven the British and Americans back into the sea, had been brought to a halt. Hitler returned to Berlin and never left it again. The Allies were now bombing Berlin heavily, and the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, the OKW, which had its headquarters in Zossen, tried to persuade Hitler to move out to them, but he refused. The regular situation discussions now took place in the Reich Chancellery, and they usually lasted until early the following morning. One followed quickly on the heels of the other, because the situation was constantly changing, and always for the worse. The atmosphere in the concrete bunkers under the Reich Chancellery was becoming more and more macabre as one depressing piece of news followed the other, with never a ray of hope. The best news in those days was of a defeat which was not actually a disaster. When any event gave Hitler a particularly hard jolt, he would clasp his hands behind his back and march up and down for a while with raised head. Then he would gradually become calmer. His face would assume its normal expression, and he would behave as usual, though perhaps a minute or two before he had seemed almost at the end of his tether. His fits of anger were becoming more and more frequent now, and sometimes he shouted and raved, usually when he suspected that his orders were not being carried out, or that they were being carried out unwillingly and with resistance. I have read a good many newspaper reports purporting to describe these outbursts, the alleged carpet-biting, and so on. But I can only say that although Hitler was certainly temperamental, I never witnessed anything of that sort in all the years I knew him. By the beginning of 1945, we who were closest to him had the impression that he had aged by at least 10 years since 20th of July. His right arm often trembled now, and his back grew more and more bent. It frequently happened, of course, that men came into his presence who had not seen him for some time, and then we could see from the expressions on their faces how shocked they were at his changed appearance. He was obviously going downhill fast, and nothing Professor Morel could do for him, pills, injections, hormones, vitamins, and so on, did him any good or held up the process of decline. Towards the end he rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours a night, which was not enough to counteract his increasing exhaustion. When the air raids on Berlin became heavy, the bomb-proof bunkers under the Reich Chancellery were thrown open for children in Hitler's absence, and they had been brought in from all parts of the capital so that they should at least be safe at nights and get undisturbed sleep. Every evening after that, the bunkers were like a great children's home. The little beds were there, the towels, the hair and toothbrushes, the glasses, the night things, everything the children needed. Round the walls were illustrated nursery rhymes. And as the raids grew heavier, and many hospitals were hit and damaged, part of the bunkers was turned into a maternity clinic where women could have their babies in safety. But when Hitler returned to Berlin for good in 1945, the maternity clinic became a hospital for seriously wounded men of Hitler's own Leibstandarte, and by April there were about 1,000 men being attended to there. The Reich Chancellery had been hit and damaged, and Kannenberg, who was still in charge of the domestic side, was very much worried about the fate of his precious wines, so he evacuated them to Dresden, a proceeding which annoyed Hitler because, as he said, fuel was needed for more important purposes. By March the Russians were still advancing, and Kannenberg feared that his wines would no longer be safe even in Dresden, so he got hold of a couple of army lorries, drove to Dresden, loaded up his wines, and went off to Upper Bavaria. In the neighbourhood of Bayreuth, he was stopped and his lorries were requisitioned, but at least they let him unload his wines. He managed to find provisional shelter for them, and then he went back to Berlin and tried to enlist Hitler's aid, but Hitler told him bluntly that the lorries had been very properly requisitioned. Kannenberg then appealed to Bormann, who showed more understanding for his wines and provided him with 2 log-burning lorries. With these, Kannenberg drove back to Bavaria, loaded up his wines again, and found a home for them somewhere in the south, and that was the last Berlin saw of him. As the situation grew worse, Göring used to visit us in the Reich Chancellery about every other day. One day when Hitler had once again reproached him bitterly for the failure of the Luftwaffe, not so much for its fighting qualities as for the way in which research and development had been allowed to lag, he came to me. "Bauer," he said, "you are one of the old guard. You've seen the development of flying from the beginning right down to the present day, and I don't mind telling you frankly that I don't know anything about modern flying. The thing has just passed over my head." How right you are, I thought. It would have been better for you if you'd kept up your flying instead of rolling around in special trains all the time. And I remembered those days, just after Hitler came to power in 1933. I flew Göring a lot then, and he was still an enthusiastic flyer. He would sit next to me in our old Ju-52 and even try to learn instrument flying, but later on he was given his own pilot, a very experienced colleague of mine, Flight Captain Hooker of the Lufthansa. Now and again, Goering was flown in very bad weather, and he didn't care much for the experience. Gradually, his enthusiasm for flying declined, and he flew less and less. I remember one day when we were in Vinica. Goering arrived in a 4-engined Condor from Krakow. Afterwards, he was going back to Berlin. It was excellent flying weather, and I pointed out that it would save a good deal of time if he flew straight on to Berlin, but he refused, saying that a special train was waiting for him in Krakow. By that time, it had already become clear to us all that the head of the Luftwaffe didn't care for flying anymore, and did as little of it as he could. For example, we knew that he had come by plane from Krakow to Vinica only because, partisan activity having made any journey overland dangerous, Hitler had given instructions that VIPs should travel only by plane. It was already a joke amongst us that Goering ought really to have been railway minister, not air minister. And now, at a time when the Luftwaffe could get off the ground at all only with difficulty and at the cost of lives, the person responsible for it, the Reich Marshal and Reich Air Minister, was forced to confess that technical developments in the air had gone beyond him. The work to convert the new Junkers 290 plane for our use began in the summer of 1944. It was a machine originally designed as a long-distance Atlantic reconnaissance plane. It had 4 engines, each of 1,800 horsepower, a total weight of 40 tons, and a range of almost 4,000 miles. Its normal cruising speed was well over 200 miles an hour, and its top speed was well over 300 miles an hour. Its crew consisted of a pilot, a mechanic, a wireless operator and observer, and 10 men to man its heavy machine guns. In fact, it was a veritable fortress, and it represented tremendous progress. In all, it could carry 50 passengers, and I am convinced that in ordinary circumstances it would have proved a worthy successor to the famous Ju-52, which conquered the world, peacefully, in 1932.